and welcome to the Debrief. This is Carolina Journal's weekly wrap-up of everything happening in public policy and politics. As we get closer and closer to November, the news is getting more and more every day. So we've got the latest of everything that's been happening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Donna King. I'm editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal. Our whole team is here with us. Of course, Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation with lots of good updates. And then David Larson, Carolina Journal's opinion editor. Got the latest from him. And then Katie Zenders, a reporter covering the state legislature and state government and everything happening with your state government here in Raleigh. All right, let's kick it off. One thing, we've got just 5 months to go until the November elections. There's been some movement in the numbers this week. It really is interesting. We're seeing that, particularly after the NCGOP convention last week, that we may be seeing a bump. Republicans' enthusiasm is really growing. The Cook Political Report has news out this week. They're now calling the gubernatorial race here in North Carolina a toss-up, and that made national news. Now, I will say, got to point out, Carolina Journal's poll earlier this week also had it as a toss-up, calling it a tie. What's changing, I think, is how the rest of the country is viewing this race. They had been calling it a lean Democrat. What we're seeing on the ground and covering these events and doing all this kind of thing, that the enthusiasm among Republicans is growing as their frustration with inflation is growing. So we might be seeing a trend that rolls through the summer. Certainly a long time to go. One of the things that we've been talking about a little bit is how inflation is being messaged by each party. You pointed out an interesting tweet out this week.
Yeah, well, just for the broader picture, I guess first is Politico had a article out saying Democrats are in freak out mode over Biden.
Right.
And inflation and immigration and crime. There's a few issues that are at the top of every poll pretty much of these are the ones that voters are most concerned about. Sure. And so that's not looking good for them. In battleground states like ours, Biden's trailing by 7 points or so. And just, down ballot, that's going to have an impact. Maybe that's why it's tightening for governor.
Sure.
So on messaging for inflation, just thought it was interesting. The North Carolina Democratic Party's, what would that be? The executive director,
yes.
Anderson Clayton?
Yes.
She had a tweet, somebody, just a random, there's summer sales coming, inflation weary, to help inflation weary customers. And, maybe this is their new messaging push is that's not, due to inflation. It's due to the fact that they've been price gouging. All of these companies have been price gouging.
So they're blaming the retailers.
They're blaming the retailers. I guess we haven't been dealing with inflation these past couple years. It's been just companies decided all of a sudden they realized they can just raise prices to whatever, and they've been gouging, and maybe now they're going to give us some break with with summer sales. So it was just interesting. As free marketeers here at John Locke, we probably we see inflation. It's not caused in a competitive environment like a free market system. You're not going to have people just randomly increasing prices by a lot. So just interesting that, that attention to that messaging that maybe they are concerned about inflation. They're concerned about, the tightening governor's race.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, it's a tough argument to make. I mean, people vote their pocketbook. That just seems to be the way it is. Do you think this message will land? I'm hearing it not just from Anderson Clayton, but I'm hearing it from the Biden administration. They're blaming the suppliers. They're blaming COVID still 4 years later. They're blaming retailers. Do you think that that's going to land with voters?
I don't think so. I mean, it seems like they're grasping for a way to redirect that because it is such an enduring issue that it doesn't seem to be going away. Even though the rate of inflation is lowering,
right?
That doesn't mean inflation. It's like if you're in a boat and it filled up a lot, and now it's not filling up as fast. That doesn't really make the people inside the boat feel much better. Sure. So I think they're what they're wanting is prices to come down. They don't just want them to rise slower. But so they've tried to portray that slowing. Rising slower inflation rate as a good thing, or maybe it's company's fault, and it's tough to see, if any of those will stick with voters.
Sure. Mitch, a year ago, 2022, 2 years ago, inflation was 9%. So, and that's going into the midterms. So now it is lower, but I think people are still feeling the pain. We've got a chance to talk to food producers and retailers and all these other things, and they're saying it's energy, that is why the prices are up. What are your thoughts on this? What are we're talking about at John Locke?
Well, certainly the fact that inflation is lower doesn't mean there's less inflation, and it doesn't mean that prices have gone back to where they were,
Right,
which
right.
is what people are concerned about. And I am shocked that the executive director of the North Carolina Democratic Party exhibits little understanding of economics,
Sure.
because the party in general exhibits little understanding of economics and thinks that you can tax your way into prosperity. There are all kinds of problems with what the Democratic Party is calling for these days. So the fact that Anderson Clayton would try to say that inflation-related prices are because of price gouging doesn't shock me at all. The other thing, going back to your initial point that I think is worth mentioning, is the fact that North Carolina's gubernatorial race has now been moved from lean Democratic to toss-up,
Sure.
is a part of a recognition that Roy Cooper was very unique. I should say very unique because you're either unique or
Well,
not.
sure.
Roy Cooper was unique in the sense that he is the type of Democrat who could be successful in North Carolina regardless of what happened to any
True.
other Democrats. And that is not necessarily the same to be said of Josh Stein.
Okay.
Josh Stein has won 2 statewide elections, but they were both very close. And so he is not in the same position that Roy Cooper is in. And I think people looking at where things stack up, Republican versus Democrat, have to take out of their mindset that you have a Cooper-like person running for governor on
Right.
the Democratic side. It's not. Josh Stein is not Roy Cooper. He's going to have a much larger challenge, and that's why things look a little bit better from the perspective of the Republicans having Mark Robinson than if it was anyone running against Roy Cooper.
Right.
Interesting in
Right.
that Cook political report too is they gave a lot of the credit for that tightening to Mark Robinson being maybe a much better candidate than the Democrats or others had expected. With
Sure.
his fundraising has been much higher than
Yeah,
they
he's
thought,
definitely
like 10.5 million, I think, and then also maybe just messaging discipline that they might have assumed he's just going to be bombastic and say a bunch of things, put his foot in his mouth, and Josh Stein will walk away with it. But he's been more disciplined on messaging too than they might have expected. So that's another big part of it. Just making more competitive race.
To that point, North Carolina GOP convention was last weekend. It seemed to be a lot of enthusiasm in the room for the gubernatorial candidate, but he's also seemed to have been successful in really focusing on things like inflation and education and those core issues that in our polls in Carolina Journal seem to be bubbling up to the top. Plus, being able to say, okay, he is closely aligning himself with Trump at a time where Biden is just not popular. And then juxtaposition, you have Josh Stein giving a standing ovation here in Raleigh to President Biden. So Stein doesn't seem to be gelling as an independent candidate, more as trying to be a Cooper 2.0.
Well, he definitely, if he's going to win, will have to get some of the people who were the Cooper Trump voters.
Right.
The people who voted for Donald Trump probably like the Republican message a little bit more than the Democratic message, but still supported Roy Cooper. Remember that Cooper barely won his first election, 10,000 votes over Pat McCrory. And the second time around had a much larger win, but that was in the COVID year when the Republican candidate Dan Forrest had basically gotten the reputation of being anti-mask and anti-doing anything about COVID. And people still, by the time of that November election, were a little bit worried about COVID. And I think Dan Forrest's initial skepticism of it still came back to bite him then. So Roy Cooper had a lot of luck in the sense of timing. And now Josh Stein is facing a much different scenario. As you mentioned, Mark Robinson, incredibly popular among Republicans.
Right.
We can see that in the way other people have campaigned. They not only have wanted to be the Trump candidate, they want to be the Trump-Robinson candidate.
Sure. Hal Weatherman came in for an interview with Teresa Opeka, our reporter that covers the executive branch, and he was telling us on the way out that everywhere he goes, Robinson seems to really have that grassroots base Republican support. The North Carolina Democrats are having their convention this coming weekend. The question is, will they be able to rally that level of base support for Josh Stein? Be certainly interesting. Meanwhile, the state legislature they're gearing up for November elections on a break this week because of the death of the father of North Carolina House Speaker Tim Moore. So it's been kind of slow in the state legislature. Not a ton to report, but certainly before he left, Moore filed a pretty important piece of legislation, might show up in November. What do we have?
Right. So Moore filed House Bill 1074, which is a constitutional amendment that could possibly be on the ballot in November. And basically, this is to change the language of the Constitution for citizen-only voting.
Okay.
Similarly, the Senate did file a bill last year that is still eligible for consideration in this session. Senate Bill 630 was filed by Senator Brad Overcash, Senator Daniel Warren,
Okay.
and Senator Gaston.
Daniel, yeah.
Dr. Andy Jackson here at the Locke Foundation says that there's not as much enthusiasm for the Senate in the Senate side for this bill.
Okay.
And so basically what the bill would do is change the language of the Constitution to ensure citizen-only voting in North Carolina.
Okay.
There's a little bit of dispute over whether or not the Constitution currently prohibits non-citizen voting. So what this bill would do would
We're talking about the state constitution.
Yes,
Yes,
state
of course.
constitution would remove all doubt of that. I can't remember the exact language of the bill.
Sure.
Dr. Andy Jackson has proposed slightly different language. However, he says he doesn't have a problem with the current language in the bill. And the House bill is basically an exact mirror of the Senate bill. They're
Okay.
almost completely identical.
So if the chambers were to pass it, what happens next?
So it goes on the ballot in the fall, and it'll
Okay.
give citizens of North Carolina an opportunity. Is this something that they want to support? And there's a poll from the Remington Research Group. 89% of North Carolinians support only citizen voting. 87% support a constitutional amendment.
Okay.
So I'm not sure where that 2% disparity is.
Sure.
But yes, it looks like very likely
So
if
it
it's
would
passed
pass.
in the legislature, it would pass.
And
Yeah.
probably draw a lot of folks to the polls, I would think.
And that would probably be the reason why it will or won't get on the ballot. We know that at least under the current legislative leadership, whether they are going to put constitutional amendments on the ballot tends to be tied very closely to whether they think it would help them at the ballot
Sure.
box in their other
Of
races.
course.
The last time that they put a bunch of amendments on the ballot, there's things like lowering taxes or
Right.
voter ID.
Right to
other
hunt and
things
fish, yeah.
Right to hunt and fish, things that are very popular.
Yeah.
And so that will be part of the calculus. If they want to put this on the ballot, you can be sure that they think that that will help them in other parts of the election process.
Sure. All right. We'll be following that really close. As we've been talking a lot about inflation, food prices. I had the opportunity to meet with some food producers over the last few weeks. And one of the things that they've told me is that the price of energy is really driving food prices. One of them gave me an example that's saying, okay, we knew packaging for our meat products was going to go up 2% a year. But over the last, say, 6 months, that packaging for food price, the price for food packaging is going up almost 11% per month.
Wow.
So they're going to keep producing food. They're going to have to, be whole somewhere along the road, and it's really hitting the poorest people among us. And that's kind of what inflation is, right? Yeah, it's a tax on poor people. You're doing a fantastic series called Sowing Resilience. You can find it on carolinajournal.com. Katie and a group of our colleagues here at the John Locke Foundation are looking into food insecurity in North Carolina and how we can protect the food supply chain from growers to the consumers, and really examining some of our neighbors who are in a tough spot when it comes to food. Tell me a little bit about the series.
Yeah, so far we've done about half a dozen interviews, and I got a lot more coming down the pipeline. But we've been able to talk to farmers, experts, people that work in food pantries, different people in these areas about food insecurity and how it's affecting people across the state. So I've talked with Dr. Peter Morris, who's the CEO of Urban Ministries of Wake County. I talked with a local farmer, Mike Jones.
Right.
I talked with Cameron Lewis at UNCP.
Sure.
And so what we're finding is that food insecurity is predominantly affecting, of course, the lower income bracket. And what I'm finding some of the common denominators are that almost every single person is telling me is transportation and affordable housing affect food insecurity, because these lower income brackets are being pushed to the urban and rural areas of the county. They're being pushed to the outskirts of the county.
Okay.
And so that is where we're finding food deserts. Food deserts being either a lack of affordable food or a lack of access to that food.
Okay. It is tough. It is a really
tough.
difficult problem because to find a place to live that's affordable, often they're going way outside the city, and then government regulations create another layer of difficulty in getting that food to them.
Right.
Yes, that's a big
Yeah.
issue. You also have the issue of the fact that we are such a popular place
Sure.
that a lot of people are coming in, and that drives up costs, which means the people who are of lesser means have less of an opportunity to get housing in places that they used to be
Sure.
able to live in.
What's the
Because
issue? You know, what's the,
a lot of these people that are being pushed to the outskirts of the county, they don't have transportation, or they don't have the gas money to get to these areas, and so that's a big factor. Another sector that we're seeing that I don't think a lot of people realize is college students are really being affected by
sure.
food insecurity, which I didn't realize. I don't think a lot of people realized, and so Cameron Lewis at UNCP is doing great work with the Care Resource Center at UNCP. He was a college student there during COVID, and then he's
UNC Pembroke? Yeah,
Yes,
sure.
UNC Pembroke. He worked in the food pantry as a college student, and
Right.
then now he's kind of the director of the resource center there. And so they have a grant-funded coalition group that allows students to talk about the problems there. They also have a peer support system because I think a big problem is the stigma and the shame of these college students. They don't know how to handle this, and they're college students, so they're still coming in. They're figuring out how to budget their lives, and a lot of these students, they do have swipe cards or whatever they're called.
One card, yeah.
Yeah, but there's a limited number of swipes per semester. So
Sure.
if they don't know how to budget, like once those swipes are gone, they're gone. Like
Sure.
they can't be reloaded for the semester, so
Sure.
they have to wait until the next semester. And so at UNCP, they've had so their academic year is July to June, and in 2022 they had over 2,400 visits.
Wow.
In 2023 they had
the food
over
pantry.
yes.
Wow.
In 2023 they had over 3,900 visits, and as of April of this year they had 4,241 visits.
It's not a big school. Yeah.
It's not. No, it's really not. Yeah.
Sure.
And since September, their average has been between 249, the lowest being in December because probably most students are home for the holidays, I'm
Sure, sure.
assuming, and then over 700 visits in April.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. Well, you know, it's tempting to say, okay, we need another government program, right? So one of the things that we've been talking about internally is what is the free market answer to this? And that's tough, right?
It is tough. If it were easy, we'd already have the
Right,
answer. But of
right.
course, anytime you set up a government program, you're going to get some unintended consequences. And that's one of the things when people say, oh, maybe the government should step in here or step in there. What they need to say is, okay, if that happens, what's going to be
Then
the downward effect, and what will the government have to then step in to do to correct? So it is something to put on the table and to get all the good minds together to think about.
Sure.
What is the free market opportunity? Usually, one of the best options for getting to the markets to help is to take away regulatory barriers.
Sure.
We talked about the fact that if there's a lack of access, is it because there's some sort of zoning or other regulations
Sure.
that are
Zoning is a
stopping people
problem.
from
Zoning
being
is a
able
problem?
to get in?
Okay.
Yeah.
Because one of the things you've seen with zoning sometimes is that it's hard for someone to set up a shop that might be helpful
Sure.
and provide food because it's a residential area and you have to be in the commercial area instead. And so looking at some of the things that are standing in the way of the market coming in and doing its job, that's something that we need to look at.
Sure.
And you mentioned energy,
Yeah.
a lot of them saying that.
Sure.
I think that each part of this problem, you can see like with packaging of
Yeah.
the food, that's petroleum products
Right.
of
Sure.
of oil-based, for energy that, you're talking about unintended consequences of government programs. A lot of this probably, comes back to, people who want kind of a green energy economy that are really cracking down on fossil fuels. Down the line, there's unintended consequences on food.
Sure.
And, a lot
You
of
gotta
the
get the food to the
transportation.
store, yeah.
the
Yes.
supply chain, all of that kind of thing comes back to, if you really want a green energy economy, you're going to have a lot of consequences to people who drive gas vehicles. Or you're talking about transportation is a problem
Yes.
for people.
Yeah.
Supply chain on building new houses. All of that just adds an extra layer of cost down the entire line of the supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to be watching that really closely. Anything else that really struck you as particularly powerful in this series? I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Yeah, so the one area of the state where transportation is actually not an issue is Robeson County.
Oh, interesting.
And I talked to Dr. Phoebe Harris at Robeson Community College. Her profile is going live on Friday morning, but
Okay.
she said that transportation is not actually an issue there, but affordable housing is a big
Okay.
issue there for pushing people to the outskirts of the county.
Right.
So that is an interesting anomaly.
is.
RCC, they do partner with UNCP sometimes when UNCP has a surplus
Right.
of donations to their pantry. They they will give them over to RCC. RCC also got a Finish Line grant, came down from the federal level of about $3,500, and they're hoping to get that grant again. So,
All right.
but it's largely local donations, and then up until December, their main donor was Second Harvest.
Okay.
Yes.
Sure, sure. All right, we're going to be following that really closely. Make sure you check it out at carolinajournal.com. Okay, looking for you for an update on what's happening in the state courts. Some of these cases that I'm seeing seem like they have been brewing for a really long time, particularly the COVID vaccine one.
Yeah, there are a number of things that are happening. You should go to carolinajournal.com, and
Yeah.
we update on court stuff quite regularly. But there are a handful of cases I wanted to mention this time around. One is that COVID vaccination case. Just very briefly, 14-year-old high school kid in Guilford County. He's alerted that he might have been exposed as part of being a member of a football team. He's got to get a COVID test before he can go back and play again. So he goes to one of the high schools where he thinks he's getting a COVID test. There's actually a COVID vaccine clinic going on there.
Okay.
The people try
So
to
he
give
thinks he's getting a test.
thinks he's getting a test.
Okay.
The people say, okay, we're giving you the vaccine. He says, I don't want the vaccine. I just
Right.
want a test. They tried to call his mom, couldn't reach the mom, so they had no parental consent. And someone said, oh, just give it to him anyway.
Oh.
And he got the Pfizer vaccine.
Oh, my gosh.
So he and his mom sued. They've lost at the lower court levels, but the state Supreme Court has agreed to take up the case.
Okay.
And the issue is, does a federal law that dates back to about 2006 provide immunity to the Guilford County Schools and the Old North State Medical Society? Basically, all the other courts have said yes. This federal law basically says you can't file suit
Okay.
because they were allowed, I mean, even if they had conduct that the Court of Appeals labeled as egregious, they
Sure.
can get away with it because of this federal law. State Supreme Court's going to take up that notion. Two other interesting cases. One deals with the MAP Act,
Okay.
which is now defunct, but back from the late 80s through the mid-2010s, the state DOT had this tool called the MAP Act where they could designate a highway corridor,
Right.
and if your property was in that map, you couldn't do anything to it. You could sell it
Sure.
at a discount because no one else could do
Yeah.
anything with it, but you couldn't develop anything, do any improvements. And so basically the state Supreme Court in 2016 threw out the MAP Act. And ever since then, DOT has been having to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to people who were negatively affected by the MAP Act. There are two cases right now at the State Court of Appeals that could have a major implication on the rest of the payments for the MAP Act.
Okay.
Because the plaintiffs in this case said, okay, you owe us the money for taking our property away from the MAP Act, but since the MAP Act went away and you came back and wanted to get our property again, you need to pay us the full value as if the MAP Act had never happened.
Okay.
The DOT is saying, no, that's not what the Supreme Court precedent's saying, and the plaintiffs are saying, but that's different. When they ruled,
Sure.
the MAP Act was still in effect. You need to pay us for what you did on the MAP Act, and you need to pay us what anyone else would pay to get the same property.
Right.
And the DOT is saying if that decision that came out of a trial court is upheld, that could be hundreds of millions of more dollars for the remaining MAP Act cases, and might even spawn some new MAP Act cases. So it'll be
Sure.
interesting to see. Very briefly on the last one, we know UNC and Duke are rivals. They're rivals in everything, and they're also rivals in terms of their health systems.
Okay.
And one way in which that comes out is in fights over certificates of need, the
Okay.
whole con thing that
Sure.
we talked about in the past. Right now, there is in the state courts a fight over certificate of need for new hospital beds in Durham County, which is Duke's home. UNC wants to move in there and has won some support from the state regulators to be able to build a new hospital in Durham County. Duke is fighting it. And in a court filing this week, UNC Health's lawyers said, wait a minute, Duke, you're making the opposite arguments in two different cases. In one case, you say this. In another case, you say the exact opposite. And you're only doing this because you're trying to keep us out of Durham County.
Right.
So it'll be very interesting to see what the courts say on that.
Sure, sure. All right, we'll be following those really closely. One thing I do want to bring up, you remember last week we talked a little bit about the folks who were living in the Fremont Town Hall. I don't know if y'all saw the story. You could see it at carolinajournal.com. But apparently in the town of Fremont in North Carolina, they were letting people live in Town Hall with like their pets.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a crazy story. Okay, another one. Now, the state auditor's office has released a report that says that at Fayetteville State University, they've got 3 chancellors that were charging like $500,000 to the credit card for Fayetteville State University. So her report out, well, you can find that on carolinajournal.com. Little twist in this story. One of the chancellors who was accused of this,
And this was an assistant chancellor,
yeah,
not the
chancellor,
chancellor,
but an assistant chancellor. One of the ones that is accused of this is now the director of communications for the North Carolina House Democratic Caucus.
Or was.
Or was
until this news came out, and then she decided to step down.
Yes. Okay. So you have all the details there. There's always something going on. Always something brewing down there. So the details on that are on carolinajournal.com. Right before we head out, I want to talk real quick. We were talking about COVID, not having permission to give a kid a COVID vaccine. This family, I've got a story coming out. I got to talk to their family. They've got a piece of legislation before the state Senate right now on unvaccinated kids.
Right. So this piece of legislation was filed last year in the House and passed the House bipartisan vote, I think 91 to 25.
Oh, okay. Democrats on board.
Yes. House Bill 586. And so Chrissy and Lee Hicks have a daughter named Yulia. She was adopted from Ukraine.
Okay.
She is turning 16 next Wednesday.
Uh-huh.
And she has what is known as senior Loken syndrome.
Okay.
She was adopted in 2021 from Ukraine. And she did 2 years of dialysis at Duke University Health. And she needed a transplant. And Duke denied her the transplant because she was not COVID vaccinated.
Okay.
So the story went national, and ECU Health stepped up and gave her a transplant just over a year ago, May 25th of 2023.
Okay.
This legislation is sponsored by Representative Celeste Carnes, but if it passes in the Senate, basically it would keep hospitals from Duke from saying, no, we won't give you a transplant because you're not vaccinated.
Okay.
Not just at Duke, but all the hospitals.
Right, all the hospitals,
So all
yes.
hospitals would be banned from denying somebody a transplant just because they were not vaccinated for COVID-19.
And wasn't one of the pieces of the story, it was an interesting wrinkle that right after this happened, Duke ended up doing some other transplant for someone who didn't have the vaccine.
Right.
And so it seemed like it was a double standard.
Exactly. Well, it's interesting. I got a chance to talk to Chrissy Hicks this week, and she said it really is about semantics, that they say, well, it's not a requirement that you have the vaccine, but it's our recommendation, and if you don't follow our recommendations, you can't have the organ. That's basically what she's saying.
It's a requirement.
So, therefore, it's a requirement. And we have a really interesting phone call recorded between the Hicks and Dr. Elaine Chambers at Duke saying, well, I can't make you do it, but you're not getting a kidney from us if you don't. And this is after she had been in dialysis for 2 years over at Duke. So this law that right now is sitting in Senate Rules Committee, no word on whether it's going to move or not. I know that there's some pressure there. They say that hospitals are saying quietly that they don't do this anymore. But you know how it is. It's not a recommendation, but if you don't follow it, that's how it goes. So
they shouldn't have a problem if they're not doing it anymore. Go ahead and make it law.
Right. Yeah, why would you care, right? So the Hicks are really paying really close attention to this piece of legislation. We have a story out on carolinajournal.com with that phone call recording if you want to take a listen. So we'll be following that story as it makes its way, hopefully going to be showing up here in the Senate shortly. All right, well, that's all the time we have for the debrief. Thanks so much for joining us, and make sure you come on back next week with everything going on in your state legislature.